Are you speaking, Anne? Because there's no sound.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me now?
All clear.
All righty. The point is that no capitalist who can afford to innovate can resist the temptations of being the first mover. The profits are too great and will give him enormous sums to stay ahead of his competitors. Capitalism provides enormous incentives for technological change. It promotes the growth of the productive forces. As already intimated, Schumpeter thought the only real surplus value was this transient extra surplus value made through innovation, not exploitation, because Marx's surplus value as such would quickly be eliminated through capitalist competition. Capitalists continually seek escape from the law of value through product and process innovations, just as an aerospace engineer tries to design a plane that can escape the law of gravity. Like the planes that will run out of fuel, the capitalists will exhaust their temporary technical advantage and are brought back to Earth only, however, to escape it again. It's kind of waves, right? Cycles. One can find a bold defense of capitalism in terms of its extraordinary record of innovation in the last book by János Kornai, who was arguably the leading analyst of the failure of socialist economies. A former Marxist, he became a Schumpeterian. For Marx, this innovation can often come at the price of much worker suffering, unemployment, and a long-term tendency for the rate of profit to fall, which will make the functioning of capitalism difficult and conflictual. But capitalism may prove, or has proven sufficiently innovative to escape this fate. Now, we can see that within Marx's own theory, which he considered the deadliest missile ever fired at the heads of the bourgeoisie, there are reasons to expect that capitalism could have a long life of dynamic innovation and progress. Chapter 11, cooperation. Marx shows that large-scale cooperation among workers, whereby they become or create a trans-individual or an organism, yields productive powers and efficiencies that separated workers or serialized workers in Sartre's sense could not achieve. That is, pages 300 to 301. This will be important because Marx will show in the next chapter, 12, how craft workers were brought under the roof of a capitalist and organized to cooperate in new ways. This is the Smithian kind of approach to this. This cooperation will increase the volume of what workers can produce, reduce delays in the production process, and lower the cost of production. At times, putting workers close together in cooperative relations can make them compete to be more productive. Today, we would call it gamifying work relations. See page 298, gamifying work relations. Marx argues that social productive power developed through cooperation appears as capital's productive power. Page 306, they have organized it, but also lent it an antagonistic nature. The capitalist believes that he has become a capitalist because he is an industrial leader, but he is the industrial leader because he's a capitalist, page 304. Chapter 12, the division of labor and the manufacturing system. Marx discusses two ways in which craft workers or artisanal workers are brought together in the new manufacturing system, pages 308 to 309. Note that this means that the manufacturing system will ultimately have a narrow technological foundations on the bottom of page 310. Marx discusses here the inefficiencies of artisanal workers working with their tools and the consequence of a lifetime of sticking to one's last, which we will remember was Plato's answer to what justice is. This is footnote 56 on page 337. That is, bringing them into a system of manufacture and changing their division of labor does reduce the labor time to make a commodity, but it begins to turn workers into cogs in a machine. See pages 319 to 21. Note here the analysis of how the labor process is structured to de-skill us. De-skill, D-E-S-K-I-L-L. Capital finds it cheaper not to train all workers for complex tasks, but to break down work into simpler tasks, leaving only a few for which some workers must have extensive training. Now, Charles Babbage, the guy who gives us essentially the logic for computers, thought that this insight added to Adam Smith's theory of the division of labor. The majority of workers do simple work. They're easily replaceable. It's not in response to people's fixed or inborn nature or the inherent capabilities that the division of labor takes form, as Plato imagined with his myth of metals. People are rather adapted to the most profitable form of the division of labor. Now, how does Marx compare the division of labor within a manufacturing workshop and the division of labor within society? What are the relevant differences here on page 327? What is the fate of the worker in the manufacturing workshop, pages 331 to 332? How does Marx compare the ancient Greek defense of division of labor to the defense of divisions of labor creating within manufacturing workshops? Chapter 13, Machinery and Large-Scale Industry. Differentiating machines from tools, which are but a part of a machine, pages 342 to 4, Marx underlines that machines liberate capital from dependence on the worker for motive power. Henceforth, the machine sets the pace of work, the limits of the human body. Humans, for example, can't match the rotary blades on a mechanical harvester. And the specialized skills of most workers, see the middle of page 352. Machines are used to produce machines, and capital has now effected a real subsumption of the production process to the demands of valorization. It's a lot packed in that one sentence. The productivity of machines or the labor that they save is astounding. See pages 360 to 61. Yet capital puts a limit on the full use of technical knowledge to make and adopt machines. And what is that limit? See pages 361 to 62. Why does machinery enable the entry of women and children into the factory? And why does that raise the rate of surplus value? Page 364. Why does machinery lead to the legal revolution or the counter-revolution of the annulment of the contract as the basic legal relation between people? Page 366. Why does machinery, that is the most powerful means of reducing the labor time needed to make a commodity, become, as a bearer of capital, the most powerful means of extending the workday beyond natural limits? On page 371, what role does moral depreciation, page 373, have in this results? 373 to 377. In what ways are workers living appendages of machines? Page 390 to 91. And on 401 to 402, how can machines become hostile to workers and serve as strike breakers? Now, how does Marx describe the social consequences of the transition from manufacturing workshops put under great competitive pressure from machine factories to a machinic system of production? How could the workers' understanding of their variable nature change? This is on pages 445 to 50 and 458 to 59. Upon pains of a failure to adapt to an ever-changing work landscape, workers discover that they're not born to stick to their respective lasts and need not. With a good general education, they too can become an independent source of creative destruction to themselves, imagining themselves as other than they are. So let's tease out the implications here. Workers do not need to and cannot see themselves as born to a lifelong position or role which they are obligated to perform sincerely as in a feudal or caste order. To become plural, perhaps in the sense that the poets Walt Whitman or Fernando Pessoa may become a need of life, not a quest for authenticity by fidelity to one's putatively true and singular self. Indeed, workers understand themselves as having an abstract capacity for multiple forms of activity. Abstract labor, by implication, is not a mental abstraction, but the way workers understand the also concrete labor that they're performing at the same time. That concrete labor is but one form of the abstract activity of which they are capable. This is to, integrate the concrete labor and abstract labor as, an integrated form. Marx had long expressed this ideal of multifaceted human development. He'd written famously in the German ideology more than 20 years before Capital, quote, "For as soon as the distribution of labor comes into being, each man has a particular exclusive sphere of activity, which is forced upon him and from which he cannot escape. He's a hunter, a fisherman, a herdsman, or a critical critic, and must remain so if he does not want to lose his means of livelihood." While in communist society, where nobody has one executive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch that he or she wishes, society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another thing tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic. Now, why does Marx think capitalist production steals from the worker and the soil? Page 461. See supplemental material 2 on page 46. For why capitalism may be under a growth imperative that could destroy the sources of wealth vis-a-vis the worker and the planet. That was chapter 13, chapter 14, absolute and relative surplus value. See page 470 for what can be called a Goldilocks theory of the European physical environment and geography for the emergence of the capitalist mode of production. It's just tough enough to make people creatively exert their efforts. In private correspondence, Engels would rightly try to talk Marx out of this physical determinism as a form of materialism. Chapter 15, the price of labor power and the magnitude of surplus value increase and decrease. Note that in analyzing what determines the magnitude of surplus value and labor power's price, Marx himself understands that the price of labor can drop and that the value of labor power falls in relation to surplus value. Workers can become more exploited, and the workers' means of subsistence can keep getting larger. Read the full paragraph on page 477. I have suggested that workers could find their increasing exploitation in Marx's terms irrelevant to their assessment of their life conditions, materially improving as they may be. In short, why may what Marx would decide as a rising rate of exploitation not necessarily be experienced as oppressive by workers? Here's a sample from Jeffrey Kay's book, An Economic Theory of the Working Class. Quote, take the initial situation where half the working day is made up of necessary labor and the other half of surplus labor, giving a rate of surplus value of 100%. Assume once again a doubling of productivity in the wage goods sector that allows the existing level of real wages to be produced in half the time. But now suppose that the working class reacts to this increase in capitalist profitability and successfully struggles for a rise of 50% in real wages. They increase the basket of use values that they can buy by 1/2. Now, the following table illustrates what happens. So, you have an initial situation at 100, the productivity gains, the value of wages, drives down productivity. Surplus labor is changed, productivity is changed. The rate of surplus value is, in fact, 100% in the initial situation, but under the context of wage growth, moving from 100 to 150 in real wages, even diminishing value and increasing surplus hours, the rate of surplus value is 166%. The production of this larger real wage would require 6 hours at the original level of productivity, but productivity has doubled. So it only requires 3 hours. AC is therefore reduced to 3. The surplus part of the working day, CB, goes up to 5 hours, giving a rate of surplus value of 166%. In other words, with the production of relative surplus value, it is not only possible for the rate of surplus value to increase, to go up without any fall in the level of real wages, but for it to go up while real wages are themselves rising. This is a possibility within Marx's own framework that casts doubt on his class struggle doctrine. This is problematic, right? If workers' material position is improving, would they wage class struggle because the rate of surplus value or exploitation, as Marx calculates it, is rising? Now, Marx also refers to the intensity of the labor process in this chapter. Note how the increasing intensity of work, something that can be accomplished today due to better surveillance of every physical move. Think of ankle bracelets in a warehouse or keystroke, stroke counting, increases the production of surplus value, though the same amount of work effort is required to produce each unit, page 478. Chapter 16, different formulas for the rate of surplus value. Why does representing surplus value and labor power's value as a fraction of the value produced obscure the specific character of the capital relation? See page 486. Chapter 17, how the value and price of labor power are transformed into wages. On page 493, Marx raises the epistemological problem, that is the theory of knowledge problem, that the capitalist system objectively appears in a misleading way or spontaneously generates illusions. In his terms, the categories we use are based on the forms of appearance that essential relations take. But things often appear in such a way that they present themselves as the opposite of what they are. As every branch of science and scholarship knows, every branch except political economy. That is, the skeptical approach that Galileo took to the geocentric conception of the solar system, that is, the sun does appear to rise and set from any position on an apparently stationary Earth, Marx takes to the study of political economy. And the conclusion, our note taker comes to is Marx imagines himself as the Galileo of the social sciences. His case study of this is that there appears on the market to be the value of labor for which wages are paid. The wage form thus erases the division of the workday into parts when necessary, and surplus value paid and unpaid labor are performed. The appearance dissimulates the essential relation. See in particular pages 495 to 6 and 498. Now, Marx also explores in later volumes how price does objectively appear. not to be regulated by labor value, although it is indirectly. And in the last instance, according to him, already hinted at earlier in this volume on pages 276 to 277, why mechanization does objectively appear to be the best source of surplus value, not the exploitation of labor. Why? As we have seen, the wage appears to be determined by the value of labor, and why a crisis appears to have been caused by a shortage of money or a deficiency of consumer demand. The objective illusion is Marx's key theory of knowledge epistemological category. Chapter 18, time wages. On page 502, Marx notes that capital wants to pay only for the time that workers work, or the time that it would take them to reproduce for the ability to do the work that they do. It's not necessarily a wage that would enable them to reproduce their lives. Digital technology today enables work to be scheduled in response to peak demand, not necessarily in a regular way. So how can a capitalist schedule workers think today through digital tools such that the wage earned is not sufficient to reproduce labor power? Page 502. Now, this leads to chapter 19 on piece wages. Note how piece wages can force the worker to intensify and elongate their work. It can be seen in the trucking industry, in which truckers are often paid by the mile that they drive, not for the time that they have worked. If truckers are paid per mile driven and not for the hours that the truck must be idle due to loading, inspections, traffic, and waiting for a safe space to park at night, and the number of hours they can drive is limited by statute, or even today, an electronic logging device, how could this form of piece wages lead to trouble? And the example is on page 510 for historical comparison. Chapter 20, variations in wages from nation to nation. See page 516 for how the world market will reward the nation in which the intensity of labor is relatively high. Chapter 21, simple reproduction. In the introduction to this part, page 519, Marx makes clear why he uses the term surplus value rather than profit. Out of surplus value will not only profit derive, but also interest and ground rent as well. After defining simple reproduction on page 522, Marx makes one of his least appreciated but most daring arguments, that the very repetition of the exchange between capital and labor over time changes the content of that relationship. It now only appears as an exchange relationship of value for value, or as a quid pro quo relation, but has become a tributary one in which capital withholds the wage out of the value that labor has produced. Capital releases that wage only if workers agree to work the hours needed to produce surplus value for the capitalists again. Again, the relationship still appears as one of exchange or a quid pro quo relationship, but an analysis of the relationship only at the macro level over time reveals that the relationship between the collective capitalists and collective workers has changed in content. It is only about the entire working class that one can say it is virtually enslaved to the capitalist class. But that implies you can't say that about an individual worker. After all, the value with which her wage is paid may not have been from the new value that she herself had produced. It is only when we look at the value used to pay wages for the working class as a whole could one possibly say that workers are paid out of value that has already been appropriated without equivalent form or equivalence from them as a class. This gives us the paradox that what is not true for a single worker, that is virtual slavery, is true for the working class as a whole. One could then argue that this is, logical nonsense and implies that the working class is not a name for individual workers, but in a sense itself an individual as real and unique as individual workers. See pages 522 to 524 and 526, and also page 528 for penetrating analysis of why the independence of the worker who makes a work contract apparently freely and is thus bound by it is a fictio juris. This is one of the more difficult arguments that Marx makes, so read this slowly. Chapter 22. How surplus value is transformed into capital. The capitalist has the dilemma of whether to spend the surplus value as revenue or to capitalize it as additional constant and variable capital, i.e., accumulate. On page 542, Marx gives the bourgeoisie the historical mission of accumulation to a hitherto unprecedented extent. On pages 544 to 46, Marx gives one of the most memorable character sketches of the capitalist ever written. See pages 553 to 54 for why the rate of accumulation may well accelerate. Chapter 23, the general law of capitalist accumulation. If capital accumulates extensively, say, builds new factories with the same ratio of machines to workers, then the system may actually run into a shortage of labor at some point, giving rise to a cycle of expansion and contraction. In biology today, this is called a predator-prey dynamic and modeled with the Lotka-Volterra differential equations. Marx's description of this dynamic is verbal. See page 568. Marx is interested in how capital balances its expansiveness with its voracious appetite for surplus labor, for they easily come into conflict. He captures how the balance is maintained to capital's advantage without being the intention of any actor in the system, page 569. Now, what does Marx mean by the organic composition of capital, 570? What does he mean by the concentration and centralization of capital, 574? How does capital accumulation depend on and itself create a relative surplus population or an industrial reserve army of labor? Pages 575 to 93. What does Marx mean by the general law of accumulation? Pages 589, 593. Note again that the very process of mechanization that enables a rising small s over small v with a cheapening of wage goods, the necessary part of the workday, falls relative to surplus labor time. Also means capital falls as a proportion of rising capital outlays. This in turn is labor saving, right? This in turn reduces the rate at which the absolute demand for labor rises, that in turn engenders a rising relative surplus population or reserve army of labor, a law of population specific to the capitalist mode of production. The demand for labor does not rise pari passu with the growth of the proletarian population, itself the result of multiple factors, the expropriation of peasants and craftsmen, artisans, as well as reduced infant mortality. We could add, so there are demographic features to this. Marx provides a nuanced disaggregation of the relative surplus population. He wants to show how it's both a result of capital accumulation and a precondition for it. Otherwise, labor would not be available for the fits and starts of capital accumulation. As Pietro Basso summarizes, the forms of the relative surplus population include A, the top stratum of often skilled workers who are only periodically unemployed, B, the latent reserve army of labor who may be underemployed in rural protection and can be recruited during long upswings of capitalist production, C, a stagnant layer at the margins of the society of active laborers, but willing to work, and D, a surplus population who becomes incapable of work and falls into a sub-proletariat. Let me rely on Pietro Basso's summary of the argument. Marx's main field of investigation is Great Britain, although at the end of chapter 25, this shifts to Ireland, where Marx's study finds similar phenomena to those facing the English rural proletariat. In fact, the formation of a relative surplus population and an industrial reserve army depends on the general laws of motion of the capitalist mode of production, a mode which, for the first time in history, has made existential insecurity of the working masses and chronic poverty of broad layers, among them a quote-unquote normal phenomenon of society. This process occurred in both England and Ireland, which Marx analyzed first separately and then in their colonial relationship, and we subsequently find the process again in every other country taken over by capitalism. This is evidently the case in the global South today, where the all-out development of capitalist relations of production under the aegis of agribusiness multinationals is leading to massive emigration from the countryside, 30 to 40 million people a year at an unprecedented pace. The Industrial Reserve Army is a product of capitalist development, but also its precondition in the sense that it is always available at any moment to satisfy just in time the changing needs of capital accumulation. This is essential in periods of stagnation or crisis, like at the end of a war, as well as periods of productive paroxysm, since in both cases it puts pressure on the active army of labor by curbing its demands and containing or lowering the average value of labor power through no choice of the workers, of course. Marx's analysis here rounds off his definition of the absolute general law of capitalist accumulation, valid for all countries and all stages of this mode of production and reproduction of the life of society. Quote, the greater the social wealth, the functioning capital, the extent and energy of its worth, the greater is the Industrial Reserve Army. This nexus connecting capital accumulation, active army of labor, and industrial reserve army has a profound effect on the terrain of class struggle. It rivets the worker to capital more firmly than the wedges of Hephaestus and Prometheus to the rock, held Prometheus to the rock. Quote, the orderly functioning of this mechanism, which permanently divides the class living from wage labor and fuels, competition between the employed and the unemployed or underemployed, is of fundamental importance for capital. For centuries now, it has supplied it with policies and imagery that have tended to entrench the dividing lines between the two armies of labor. This is why Marx, a sworn enemy of the modern chains for the exploitation of human labor, unconditionally promotes planned cooperation between the employed and the unemployed in order to obviate or weaken the ruinous effects of this natural law of capitalist accumulation on their class. For every combination between employed and unemployed disturbs the pure action of this law. For Marx, therefore, number one, the production of an industrial reserve army is a law, not a passing accident or dysfunction of capitalism linked to this or that social policy, or, to keep with our main theme, this or that policy on migration. Number two, the only force that can challenge it is the combined struggle of the employed and the unemployed. To omit this twofold political and historical theoretical conclusion is brazenly to falsify Marx's and Marxist theory on the question. Now, you can skip the case studies at the end of the chapter, but the last paragraph on the surprising consequences of the migration of the Irish Reserve Army of Labor to the United States is provocative. Chapter 24, the so-called original accumulation, also referred to as primitive in other texts. Marx has clarified how the capital relation reproduces its own conditions of possibility. i.e., the valorization of capital, reproduces Mr. Moneybags, who, in virtue of his ownership of the produced commodities, has capital once they're sold to invest again, and proletarians who, in virtue of the full use of their wage to reproduce their labor power, must sell their labor power again. That is, Marx has been interested in capitalism as a self-constraining system of production, i.e., as a system that has to produce the conditions necessary to reproduce itself again. This means not only the reproduction of the class relation, but also the production of the capital goods or machinery and wage goods that will be needed for the next cycle of accumulation and production. This latter feature is analyzed in the reproduction schema in Capital Volume 2. Now, but Marx does not think the capitalist system was born as Venus fully grown. It was the result of a violent, protracted process. It did not have fairy tale beginnings, so people who find it just today because they believe it came into existence through just transactions depend on myths of its origins, not its real history of birth. Marx dispels myths of where the capital and the propertyless workers came from in the first place to create this self-reproducing system of exploitation. Now, Rosa Luxemburg would argue that this original accumulation does not belong only to the historical origins of the system. The expansion of the system engenders ongoing violent land acquisitions in the colonies and elsewhere, for example. Marx will show that this order, apparently based on property rights meant to secure ownership of one's labor, originated in the open violation of any property rights people should have had and did have. Marx's previous analysis was meant to show, inter alia, that the system in its maturity has turned into an empty shell of the property rights on which it claims to stand. That is because due to its ownership of the means of production, capital is in a position to offer just the wage to labor in a quid pro quo to get the full value of what labor will produce. Property rights thus protect the theft of alien or surplus labor time. At its beginning, capital openly and nakedly violated property rights and communal norms to turn peasants and yeomen into propertyless workers available for capital to exploit. See, for example, the bottom of page 659 to 670. The second paragraph of page 662 on ear clipping. In this original phase, capital also denied the incipient proletarian class the freedom to bargain for wages and make contracts. See the brutal details in the second paragraph on page 668 and the first full paragraph on page 672. Marx makes two interesting points in the course of this analysis. First, the propertyless and vulnerable conditions that workers take as natural or inscribed in the human condition required huge dollops of violence in order to bring about. Pages 670 and 688 to 89. And second, is there anyone else? Well, anyway. Marx makes so first, the propertyless and vulnerable condition that workers take as natural or inscribed in the human condition required huge dollops of violence to bring about. 670, 688 to 89. And second, the coercive laws that enabled capital to bring workers to heel. This system, not of the rule of law, but rule by law, sinisterly remain on the books long after the system has come into maturity, page 674. As for where the original sum of capital derived that kick-started the system, Marx finds its source in conquest, whether by the state or private trading companies, slavery, war profiteering, state bonds paid through regressive taxation, coercive colonial trading, protectionism, and opium trading, page 682. The key theme is that the use of the concentrated and organized violence of the state quickens a transition in the mode of production, a line that is foreboding for the future of socialism and implicates Marx, at least here, in the violence employed to achieve communism in the 20th century. Marx underlies that the system of factory labor in England was made possible by the enormous supply of cotton produced by enslaved Africans in America. In fact, the veiled slavery endured by factory workers rests on a brutal and open system of slavery converted from a patriarchal institution into a ruthlessly commercial one. Page 688. Having laid bare the violence by which the capitalist system was birthed, Marx analyzes capitalism as a dialectical process by which the large capitals that expropriated smaller capitals and dispossessed the peasantry will themselves be fully expropriated by a class, that is, proletarians, that no other than capital has brought into existence. Again, Marx is implicated in the violence and expropriations by which 20th century communism came into existence. That Marx reads this as the inexorable logic of capital's motion should not free him or Marxists of responsibility for the consequences of their actions. However, the conviction for socialism is bolstered by the false sense of its inevitability. Historic actors still bear responsibility for the actions and foreseeing the consequences of their actions. Max Weber makes the distinction between an ethics of conviction or a passion project and the ethics of responsibility. Chapter 25, Modern Theory of Colonization. Marx emphasizes that capital is not a sum of money, new wage goods, or new machines. These things are all part of a circuit of capital. But without the relation between capitalists and workers, none of these things are elements of the circuit of capital. This is simply what the Australian colonist Wakefield discovers, page 694. Marx repeats this point on 697 by again saying that without the reproduction of the dependence of wage laborers on capital, the circuit of capital cannot be commenced and renewed. In short, the economy is not understood well as a collection of independent factors of production, an atomistic ontology. That is, what exists are independent things and individuals, things that are atomized, but a specific and dynamic kind of self-reproducing relation between classes. The relation is as much a part of reality as the classes and the individuals in those classes. In fact, the relation arguably has an ontological primacy over the relata, which would not be what they are in the absence of the constitutive relation. The ontological primacy given to historically varying relations rather than to separate selves defined in terms of some noumenal essence, takes us back to Marx's sixth thesis on Feuerbach. Feuerbach resolves the essence of religion into the essence of man, but the essence of man is no abstraction inherent in each individual, separate individual, and its reality is the ensemble or aggregate of social relations. Feuerbach, who does not enter more deeply into the criticism of this real essence, is therefore forced, number one, to abstract from the process of history and to establish religious temperament as something independent and to postulate an abstract or isolated human individual. Number two, the essence of man can therefore be understood only as genus, the inward, dumb generality which naturally unites many individuals. So, supplement one, the continuous depreciation of unit values. Here's a graphical way of understanding Marx's insistence on an inverse movement in the quantity of use values and the value of each unit produced. That is, an outward shift of the supply curve indicates that producers can produce given quantities at cheaper costs and are thus willing to sell at cheaper prices. Remember, for Marx, supply costs are reducible to labor costs. Now, this is, of course, an abstraction. Producers can thus create greater demand, not in the first instance by whetting appetites, but by making a given quantity cheaper to produce. Now, what an outward shift in the supply curve usually expresses is that labor productivity has risen, so it takes less total labor time to produce units of a good. That's what we saw up before in the tables. The cost of producing a unit can be brought down by mechanization because the machines that are used took less labor time to build than the direct working time they make unnecessary. The overall labor cost of producing each unit falls, and so does the money cost of producing each unit. This means the supply curve shifts outward as producers are willing to supply determinate quantities at lower prices. The labor theory of value can be understood as dynamic cost of production theory of price, with changes in labor time and thus cost conditions driving changes in the market. So the way to understand Marx is this: due to the cobweb theorem, supply may undershoot and then overshoot demand, or vice versa. So equilibrium is not immediately reached. And so the example photocopied into here is with hog farmers, and you can see a demand curve and a supply curve. Hog farmers must decide 1 year ahead of time how much they want to put on the market in the next year, a decision that is determined by the price they expect hogs to fetch and the cost of producing them. An increase in expected price will induce farmers to produce more, as reflected in the upward sloping supply curve in figure 17.3. And you can see this it has a web-like element to it. This is the supply curve and the demand curve. They look like lines, they can be curves, etc. Assume that in year one, the price for hogs is P1. That's there. The starting point is there. Expecting that prices will remain the same in year two, farmers put Q2 on the market next year. At this volume, however, the market clearing price is P2 rather than P1. P2 right here. So this is this ratchet. P1 to P2, right? Rather than P1, expecting that prices will remain at that level in year three, farmers produce volume Q3 for that year. The market clearing price will be P3, inducing farmers to produce Q4 in year four, etc. So you have an equivalence here: 1 to 2, 2 to 3, and then upwards. This is a outward folding spiral, and then down to here, Q4. In this case, the market clearing price will be P3, inducing farmers to produce Q4 in year four, and so on. In this case, prices and volumes form an outward spiral or cobweb pattern indicated by the bold lines in the diagram. Pleasant surprises alternate with unpleasant ones, but the expected outcome never occurs. If the relative slopes, the slopes of the supply and demand curves are modified, the result could be an inward spiral converging to the equilibrium price P star, which is here, and equilibrium volume Q, which, here, P star and Q star, which is the, price. Now, there's something irrational about the behavior of the farmers. Each of them believes that he is free to vary his output to maximize his profits, while tacitly assuming that others are just mechanically doing what they did last year. Now, while perhaps irrational, the behavior is intelligible, certainly. A French philosopher, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, said that our spontaneous tendency is to view other people as younger siblings. we do not easily impute to others the same capacity for deliberation and reflection that introspection tells us that we possess ourselves, nor for that matter, our inner turmoil, doubts, and anguishes. The idea of viewing others as being just as strategic and calculating as we ourselves does not seem to come naturally. And, for some people, quoting from John Elster, explaining social behavior is problematic. My idea is this: as system undershoots and overshoots, some producers will have introduced new productive techniques so that the supply curve shifts outward, and the system will now begin circling around a new equilibrium before it ever came to a rest at the previous equilibrium point. And before that is reached, the supply curve will have shifted again. So you can see that there is a cobweb there as well. Marx is a theorist of perpetual disruption and endemic disequilibrium as a result of the continuous depreciation of unit values. He is a theorist of dynamic disequilibrium. Karl Korsch understood this dynamic core to Marx's law of value precisely, taking up the question of the modifications Marx makes to the law of value in Volume 3 of Capital. Korsch wrote, quote, "Contrary to all adverse opinions prevailing in one or the other camp, it was never the intention of Marx to descend from the general idea of value as expounded in Capital Volume 1 by means of an ever closer determinants to that direct determination of the price of commodities, for which at a later time Walras and Pareto set up their delusive systems of n millions of equations into which we need only introduce the required n millions of constants to calculate with mathematical accuracy the price of a definite individual commodity at a given time. It was a catastrophic misunderstanding of Marx's economic theory when, after the appearance of Capital Volume 2 and 3, the whole dogmatic dispute between the bourgeois critics of Marx and the orthodox Marxists centered on the question of whether, and in what sense, the transformation of the values of the commodity into production prices by means of the intermediary concept of an average rate of profits is consistent with the general definition of value in Volume 1. As shown by the manuscripts and by the correspondence which was later published, it was long before the appearance of Volume 1 that Marx firmly established or set out the principle that the production prices of commodities produced by capitals of various organic compositions can no longer be identical with their values as determined by the law of value, either in individual cases or on average, but are only a compound result of that main factor along with a series of other factors. The particular importance of the law of value within Marx's theory, then, has nothing to do with the direct fixation of the prices of commodities by their value. It would be nearer the truth to say that the working of this law appears in the general development of the prices of commodities, in which the continuous depreciation in the value of commodities, affected by the ever-increasing productivity of social labor as a result of the continued accumulation of labor, constitutes the decisive factor. The ultimate meaning of this law, as shown in the operation by Marx in all 3 volumes of Capital, does not, however, consist of supplying a theoretical basis for the practical calculations of the businessman seeking his private advantage, or for the economic and political measures taken by the bourgeois statesman concerned with the general maintenance and furtherance of the capitalist surplus-making machinery. The final scientific purpose of the Marxian theory is rather to reveal the economic law of motion. Recall what we were looking at a couple days ago with Anwar Sheikh, the economic law of motion of modern society, and that means at the same time the law of its historical development. However, and this is why new interpretation is important, however, one can also understand Marx's law of value in static terms. Here I turn to Duncan Foley. So here you have things sort of straightened out. So you have a supply schedule, you have price, quantity, demand 1 and demand 2. Figure 1, the labor theory of value sees prices as determined by costs. In the case of commodities with a horizontal long-run supply schedule, that's this line here, there is no rent and price does not vary with movements of the demand schedule. Quote, the labor theory of value is at its root a cost theory of price in which relative prices are determined by the relative costs of production of different commodities. If costs are independent of total output, as they are in the long run in an industry with constant returns to scale, so that the long-run supply curve is horizontal at the level of the minimum long-run average costs, then relative prices are independent of demand, as in Figure 1. As a result, the labor theory of value sees prices as determined by cost. In the case of commodities with a horizontal long-run supply schedule, there is no rent, and price does not vary with movements of the demand schedule. See, that's what that straight line means. As a result of this general vision of the economic process, the classical economists were not very concerned about demand as a determinant of price. Now, recall that Ricardo explicitly excludes or accepts goods like rare paintings whose price depends solely on their scarcity from the general principles of value determination through labor time. They did recognize that the usefulness or use value of a commodity remains a precondition for its having exchange value, but also pointed out that the overall usefulness of commodities had no correlation with their value or price. The most famous expression of this point of view is the diamond-water paradox. Water is much more useful and necessary to human life than diamonds, but in normal circumstances in temperate climates, water has a much lower exchange value than diamonds. Now, in the classical view, diamonds were costly because it took a great deal of labor to produce them, digging down in mines, etc., to their low geographical density. Water is cheap in temperate climates because it requires relatively little labor to secure a water supply from springs, streams, or wells. Presumably, as far as I know, no classical economist directly addressed this question. The classicals would predict that water would be expensive in the desert because it would require a lot of labor to produce or transport water to the desert. Marx did make the prediction, however, that diamonds would become cheap if they could be produced easily from coal, that is, with a fraction of the labor required to discover and mine diamonds. If we could easily turn coal into diamonds, their value would drop below that of plain bricks. In general, the greater labor's productive power, the smaller the amount of labor time needed to make a good, and the smaller the amount of labor crystallized in a good, the smaller its value. Now, and indeed today, there are three primary reasons why lab-grown diamonds are appealing, especially to younger consumers: lower prices, bigger jewels, and sustainability. For two hypothetical diamonds with a similar appearance, a lab-grown version would be about 80% cheaper than a natural counterpart, according to Golan. Consumers get better value for their money as they can access larger, flashier stones for lower prices when they shop lab-grown diamonds. It is not the utility that a diamond provides that determines its value, but the labor time required to produce one. Supplemental material 2, why capital must grow to increase profits. Here's a short discussion of a problem raised in Capital Volume 3. We can't discuss it properly after Volume 1. In Volume 1, Marx focuses on the rate of surplus value, but not the rate of profit. Then we don't measure S, small s, in relation to V, but S in relation to C plus V. Marx has already intimated that the rate of profit will have a tendency to fall. Now, why is that? So if the rate of profit is S over divided by C plus V, and we divide numerator and denominator by V, we find that the rate of profit is positively correlated to the rate of exploitation, S over V, and negatively correlated with the composition of capital, C over V. Now, Marx thought that the C over V could and would rise faster than the S over V. SV could only rise at a diminishing rate while C over V could gallop ahead. Now, but this is disputed. And see the formalization at the end of this section. Still, Marx thought that due to this, the rate of profit would tend to fall. But, and this is not well understood, Marx, following Richard Jones, did not think that this would necessarily reduce the rate of accumulation. On the contrary, John's put the point well. Marx supplies a formula for this necessary minimum rate of accumulation, which must be attained unless the amount of profit is to decline and the system to stall. In order that the mass of profit made at a declining rate of profit may remain the same as before, the multiplier indicating the growth of the total capital must be equal to the divisor indicating the fall of the rate of profit. But Marx writes accumulation must be just a little faster than this. It must be fast enough to make that amount of profit not only stay the same, but grow perhaps a little from year to year, in spite of the fall in the rate of profit. For otherwise, there'll be no incentive for the capitalists in the whole business of accumulation. Now, this is the formula of the minimum rate of accumulation necessary to capitalism. If ever and wherever the rate of accumulation falls below this level, the system must and does jam. It gets jammed up, for it becomes more profitable for the capitalist to restrict than to expand production. And unless it pays for the capitalist better to use more capital and to give more employment, they will use less capital and give less employment. We've established the fact that there exists for any capitalist economy a certain rate of accumulation, a certain minimum speed, that is for the motion, that is to say, at which its total capital must grow if the system is to function. And we've established the fact this minimum rate of accumulation is determined by the speed at which V over C is falling, by the speed, that is to say, of technical progress. This is a conclusion of the utmost importance, for it and it alone enables us to understand why it is that it is impossible to solve the fundamental difficulty, the basis and ever-recurrent crisis of capitalism, in the simple way advocated by all reformers. The essence of every crisis is very visibly a glut. Why then, say the reformers, cannot this glut be cured by the simple, obvious expedient of distributing purchase power? Now, how can it be maintained that a policy of high wages, combined, if necessary, with the institution of social services, would not solve the problem by giving everybody the money to buy the available goods and so end the glut? At length, we can say clearly why this policy cannot be adopted. It cannot be adopted because to raise wages or to increase taxation in order to pay for social services would at once begin to diminish the rate of accumulation. It would make it impossible for the capitalists to augment their total capital at a pace sufficient to offset the fall in V over C, and so achieve that indispensable purpose, that is, some growth in the absolute magnitude of V. It is clear, moreover, that it is just precisely today, when technical progress is proceeding at an unequaled rate, when the bottom is dropping out of V over C, that every available penny must be devoted to accumulation. And this is why, as we've already seen, the capitalists in actual practice, far from trying to cure the recurrent gluts of the system by increasing the non-capitalist purchasing power, apply the paradoxical remedy of reducing everyone's purchasing power either by cutting wages or raising prices. This is what's happening now. Indeed, we saw that the whole dispute between the different schools of capitalist economics turned out to be concerned exclusively with the question of which of these methods of reducing purchasing power should be adopted, pages 252 to 3. And then there's a whole page of math here, and you can look at how the equation works out. And it does work out, but you have to think of it. And this is where you can argue, not that you're going to argue, that Marx, or at least this argument, operates in a kind of in marginal terms, because it has a limit there, right? Note here that capitalism is a powerful built-in tendency towards growth that has engendered, but does not necessarily require, a rising material throughput at odds presently with the biosphere and quite possibly the health of the working class. There is now sharp controversy over whether Marx began to explore a degrowth path for post-capitalist society due to the costs of growth on nature and workers alike, the web of nature, right? So there's a calculus-based derivation of the falling rate of profit. This is a very standard thing. There's the basic Marxian formula, the variables R, S, V, and C, R being the rate of profit, S, little s, surplus value, little v, variable capital, and C, constant capital. Note that variable capital signifies, for the most part, labor, constant capital, machinery, etc. And surplus value, that sort of thing that develops that's not necessarily identical to profit. And so I won't go through the math here, but it kind of works out. And you get a differential. And this differential is no different, with all due respect, than differentials used in other neoclassical genres, areas. The assumption that, E will tend to rise at decreasing rate is reasonable under his assumption. Marx sees relative surplus value as coming from reductions in necessary labor time due to rising productivity in the wage goods sector. That is the sector that produces the commodities. Department 2. Workers consume, right? Food, clothing, housing, etc. And then there's a numerical example here, and you can go through this to get to, what goes on here. And ultimately, it is about, what surplus hours are being produced relative to, what is being produced. Let's see. It's a little more complicated than this, but Marx's intuition here does not lay bare how far the rate of profit must fall to throttle production, and whether it will fall to this point sometime before the sun burns out. Has Marx succeeded in finding an internal limit to capital, or a limit that capital creates to itself? This is the whole David Harvey kind of thing, except not with all that math. And so there is supplemental 3, modeling the accumulation of capital, which this instructor has actually worked out. He was trained as an engineer. This guy was trained as an engineer. And so he does a Excel spreadsheet for this. Supplemental 4, William J. Blake, Elements of Marxian Economic Theory, at its criticism, 1939. And this is the glossary for all of these things, so the words don't get too crazy. Accumulation, primitive or original accumulation. Now I'm going to have to go back in there and fix some of the grammar. Capital, composition of capital, constant capital, industrial capital, merchant capital, variable capital, capitalism, centralization, circulation, capital circulation, commodity circulation. This is Department 2. The medium of circulation, and then class, of course, class struggle. And note that in the prior lectures with Anwar Sheikh, he says, well, I'm not going to talk about classes and et cetera, et cetera. And, it's true. He doesn't talk that much about classes because he's trying to work out the math or the analytic components of it without talking necessarily about class struggle. Class struggle comes from that without a lot of fanfare, and it's not really that problematic. It does. These are not antagonistic concepts. Let's put it that way. And so you can have this commodity thing and still have class, class struggle and difference. Organic composition, technical composition, concentration, cooperation, etc. You get these further. Important to have this glossary or a glossary, because these are more technical terms relative to reading Marx's Capital Volume 1. And if, the historiography of this or the lexical analysis of this can be problematic. When Marx says exchange value and value, he's implying something different with the word value in that little phrase. and that there are these additional divisions, and the idea of an immanent or intrinsic are very similar to what Sheikh was talking about in terms of indirect or direct, right? And I hope you can remember that. But the value question is discussed by Sheikh. He just uses different terms, different lexical terms. So it's a slight difference in language. And as I explicated the other day, there's a whole thingamabob about value form, which is the part of the more recent analysis of Marx built on this idea of value form. And this is form not as a container, but as a structure. And a structure is not identical to a container, right? But we do think in, however, a D.H. Lawrence sort of way that, form is more palpable than that. It's not that palpable. It is abstract. It has concreteness, but you shouldn't think of form as a container, even though I've just said that, don't think of it, you will think of it. But I think you have to resist that notion because it is talking about it as a structural element, not as something which contains something necessarily. So, you're sort of over determining the argument, in fact, by talking about it in that way. So you should rethink that as well. Now, at the end, I've tacked here in today's reading the beginning of what we will start very soon, and that is Volume 3 of Capital in preparation for Andy Higginbottom, who I hope is going to do his lecture series on Volume 3. And as we've said before, Volume 3 was never fully dealt with by Marx and essentially edited, etc., by a variety of folks, especially Engels. So it has its own issues, but they're kind of fully explained. And you can see here in Volume 3, and we're not going to go through this now, so don't go crazy. Engels talks about this. Marx is already dead, and Engels is complaining about his, his vision, Engels's vision, and et cetera. So, it's just part of growing old. So there will be that. This preface only describes his kind of process and trying to assemble this. And of course, there are issues and worth worrying about because, in fact, Volume 3 does contain certain parts, certain elements that are necessary for building a much larger materialist model. And, not a doctrinaire model, but certainly it's important. And increasingly important to see, as Higginbottom has described it, as a sort of complete yet open system.
No sound again.
Turn itself off. Oh, I see. That's what happened. All right. Well, I'm going to stop. The hell with it. Let's see if there are any questions or comments. I can't. Trying to see. No, there's lots of nice pictures. It's, but no. All righty. So I'm gonna shut off the live stream and